Okay, here we go. The recording should be starting now. Welcome, everyone. It brings me so much joy to introduce this panel and welcome you all to this session today. We have 4 Terra alumni from the Learning for Action course joining us today to talk about corporate climate action that they've been working towards and leading in their spheres of influence. We have Ani and Tim and Cody from our very first cohort. They were in Learning for Action last May to July with Liam as well. And we have Marina, who was in our 3rd cohort, the Orcas cohort, joining us for this exciting panel today. So we have 4 panelists, which is really exciting, but also a challenge to make sure we hear enough from each and every one of them. So what I'm going to do is kick it over to each of them one at a time to just give a short, max 2.5-minute intro to themselves and their recent frontiers of their climate work. And we've already shared some bios and information about these 4 panelists, but we'll just encourage each of them when you're not speaking, if you want to share anything in the chat, we'll make really good use of the chat to share information and resources that can be best conveyed that way. And we'll keep these intros more like, what are you working on right now, that so we can all kind of get up to speed and we can read about your past online. So that's the general idea. As we get past the intros and into the questions that Liam has prepared, we'll do a few of those and then we'll open it up to questions from everyone at the end. And I'll just encourage all of the panelists to keep an eye on the chat when you're not speaking to address some of those questions that might be easier or shorter answers that way. And Liam and I will be doing so as well as we co-moderate. So I'm going to go just from who I can see. I'll start with Ani to give an intro, and then I'll hand it over to Marina, Tim, and Cody. So Ani, over to you.
Thanks, Lenny. Hi, you all. It's really good to meet you all. I was in the first cohort almost a year ago, the Monarchs cohort, and I'm going to take 2 minutes to guide you through my climate journey over the last year and a half. So I'm just going to share my screen and give you a little bit of a visual that'll help you get a sense of how I've navigated my path. And this is one of like 10 million different paths. It's nothing unique or special about it, but it's how I chose to do it. So I made my climate transition in January 2020. Before that, I used to be in the aerospace industry, working with Airbus Defense and Space for several years. I loved that life, but climate was the single biggest problem of our times. There were very many reasons why I chose to go all in on climate and sustainability. Didn't really know where to start, but was convinced that it's worth spending at least 10 years of my life and taking multiple shots on goal and just giving it, doing whatever had to be done to solve for climate. So my first shot on goal was to incorporate a foundation in India, where I'm based in New Delhi, called the Sustainability Mafia, susmafia.org. And this was a breadth ecosystem play to really make sustainability a default choice. And essentially what we do with it is to build a network marketplace of sustainability entrepreneurs and taking their solutions, scale those solutions up to the demand side, which in our case is corporates, which is also the focus of this panel. So Indian corporates can find sustainable solutions really easily because we've aggregated solutions like waste heat recovery, energy efficiency, hydroponics, drip water irrigation from the best founders and entrepreneurs around the country on the supply side. We'll share a little bit more about this later. While that was being built out, found Terra and was really part of the proof of concept class, the Monarchs cohort of 25 people, and loved it. It was so great to actually organize the overwhelm of climate science, the overwhelm of climate information into a narrative and really make sense of it. And I think Terra helped me really feel like I wasn't an imposter in the space. There was a method to the madness, and there was a way of organizing all the information and putting it into boxes and really getting a grasp on it, and find the necessary tools to become a more efficient climate practitioner. While I was going on, I was obviously building susmafia.org, really finding sustainability entrepreneurs around the country, India focused, and then just took a shot to get my TEDx license for climate stories, and got a license that ended up becoming a really, really good platform to share compelling stories for a safer, cleaner, better, fairer future from sustainability entrepreneurs. So last October, we had a fantastic event where we had about 18 different sustainability entrepreneurs share their big stories worth spreading. In fact, this year we're doing TEDx 2.0 on November 13th, and it's going to be far bigger, far punchier, far more effective with a lot more stories. And this has really become like a good event on the Indian climate and sustainability calendar. And beyond that, what we started realizing was, because we were aggregating the supply side of sustainability solutions really well, without us really planning for it, corporate demand started pouring in and asking us for one single place where they could access paths to carbon neutrality, pathways to water efficiency, pathways to zero waste, because the status quo of going to a consulting firm was just too expensive and not as efficient. And we were kind of becoming a place for demand and supply matching. So we created a formal program called the Corporado program, which is now actually a product of the foundation in operation, with paying corporates going through it. And it's a network marketplace, demand meets supply model. We'll talk a little bit about this later too. Beyond that, going into this year, I got obsessed with carbon tech and carbon removal, just from a curiosity sense, and found the Air community and went through their Air boot up. I don't know if any of you've come across it so far. Fantastic way of actually organizing the chaos of carbon removal solutions and understanding, in a month, what are the various ways of going deeper into that specific segment of direct air capture, mineralization, algae, kelp, everything that comes in with the carbon removal world. And that actually spurred me to kick off and incubate a new project. I call it a pre-company project, because it is a project, but we are building it like it's a company called climbs.io. And for this, I have a co-founder who's also a Terra alum, a Narwhal. And we decided to take it through Terra Studio, the inaugural Terra Studio, which had 14 teams participate. So did Terra Learning Faction a year and a half ago, did Terra Studio a month ago. And it was such an amazing way to actually build climbs.io from zero to like a little bit more than zero, and then spin it off from there. And now we're building it like it's a company, and it's actually 2 months away from incorporation too. And it's a carbon market play. We have a really, really interesting approach to it. It's a climate tech venture, but we'll share more about it, perhaps in another conversation, not relevant to this one. And now I'm in on deck climate tech cohort number 2, and I'm 5 weeks into that. So that's my story. The metrics I'm building for are essentially how many cumulative tons of carbon have I avoided or mitigated, cumulative liters of water saved, cumulative kilograms of waste segregated, how much basic climate dignity have I enabled in society, how many livelihoods have I essentially supported through all my work, and what's the cumulative societal value created, fresh capital value created in society too, through all of these shots on goal. So to sum it up, I'm incubating clients, scaling SaaS Mafia, hosting my TEDx, and going through ODCT, and that's my climate story today.
Wow, are you sure there's not like 2 or 3 of you roaming around named Ani Gupta? That's amazing. Marina, I'll turn it over to you for your intro next.
Sure. Really impressive, Annie. Thank you for sharing. Yes, hi everyone. I'm Marina. I have just closed off a 20-year and 6-month career with the Economist Group, and I think until sort of 19 years ago, everything was relatively straightforward. So basically, media marketing professional that went into operational, sort of business management over that period of time, and kind of silently and secretly started my climate journey in 2016, where I started to choose things within my sphere of operational influence that I was able to implement within my organization, until then gaining group-wide responsibility for environmental sustainability and driving through the Economist Group's first ever sustainability strategy, including a science-based emissions reduction target, carbon removal via direct air capture, and also having phenomenally interesting intellectual discussions about the role of business and environment and stakeholder capitalism versus capitalism a la Milton Friedman. So very interesting intellectual journey. In addition to a climate action journey, and I also, in addition to Terra, did a sustainability management partial MBA program where I did deep dives on circular economy, business model innovation, and a number of other areas. And right now, I'm still in transition, looking for my next home, where I'll be certainly delivering more climate action on the intersection between business and policy.
Amazing. Thanks for that intro, Marina. And over to you, Tim.
Thanks, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm Tim. I finished the Terra cohort, the first cohort last summer with Ani and Liam and Lainey and Cody and several others. Prior to joining Terra, I kind of started my climate work in my last full-time job. So I was working in technology startups for about 10 years, since 2010, and building community for all of those companies, operating within marketing departments. So effectively building relationships for marketing purposes. And the last company I worked for was a cloud hosting company. And that's where in 2019, I started thinking I have to devote some of my energy to this climate crisis. So since I was at a big hosting company that had data centers all over the world, I organized a green team of coworkers. We did an organizational carbon audit and open sourced the kind of spreadsheet that we built to facilitate that, and shared that kind of openly with the climate action tech community, which led me to Terra, which led me to sharing it more openly with this community and some organizations picking it up and using it internally for themselves. And that was kind of my foray into this work. I got laid off from that job last February and have since just been really exploring the transition to full-on climate work, getting really involved in climate communities, and have been really drawn towards the mental health impact of climate change and the power of community to help us ourselves and each other navigate this crisis and in a healthy way, as healthy as possible. So I recently launched a community called Climate Friends, and that's my primary focus right now. And it is just the community that I was describing, a place where all of us who are experiencing this, and both physically, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, can come together and have discussions about it and process it and recharge so that we can do the work that is necessary for all of us to do and find balance in our climate journeys. And that's me.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. Cody.
Hey, everybody. I'm Cody Sims, and kind of have a handful of things that I've been working on. So in my day job, I'm at Techstars, which is an early stage venture investment organization. We have invested in over 2,000 startups over the last decade plus, and are now investing in around 500 startups per year through our global accelerator network. And about 2 years ago, decided I was really a generalist. Like I had 15 plus years of experience just in consumer internet product management work, and decided I wanted to really lean into climate. And so at Techstars started leaning into our network, interviewing the venture investors we work with, interviewing the corporate partners we work with that we run many of our accelerator programs with, and interviewing a lot of our founders and just learning about what motivated them, and particularly ones who are working around climate or sustainability, like what their focus areas were. And so did a lot of that customer discovery. Around the time of that, discovered Terra, so went through the first cohort, as Lainey has mentioned, last spring and summer. kind of was able to sort of create my own role at Techstars. You know, I'm a big believer in leveraging the skills you have. Climate needs so many skills and so many pathways. And, you know, it's tempting to think you got to go become a climate scientist or whatnot to actually make a difference. But, you know, I'm a big believer in leveraging the skills you have. So the skills that I have or that I know about entrepreneurial ecosystems, I know how to support startups. I know how to connect the dots between startups and investors and startups and business development partners. And so decided to sort of put my hand up inside Techstars and say, hey, I want to help us blow out a climate change focus. And ended up creating a thing called the Techstars Sustainability Challenge, which is about helping us draw connections between startups and partners in our network around certain themes. We did one on supply chain a while ago. We're doing one on net zero and carbon reduction technologies right now. And it's all about helping pilot ready startups actually land business development and further what they're doing. You know, I've been mentoring and supporting the startups in our portfolio. We've got about 200 companies working on climate and sustainability solutions. And I've just been really pushing our organization internally on supporting more climate friendly practices. We haven't announced this yet, but just last month we became a signatory to the UNPRI, which is the UN Principles on Responsible Investing, which has basically starts to hold us accountable to reporting on the work we're doing, both operationally to align with the UN SDGs, as well as how we report on our investment portfolio. So that'll get announced here pretty soon that we've become members of that. And then outside of my day job at Techstars, I also did, we launched a podcast focused on climate change, the Techstars Climate Tech Podcast, which you should give a listen to. Actually, Kamal from Terra was our very first guest on that. And so it's a fun one to dive into. And then outside of that, I joined the My Climate Journey community, and through that community, met Eliza Nemser and a few other people, and we launched an organization called Climate Change Makers. Climate Change Makers is now a registered 501c4 political action nonprofit. We've got funding from folks like Preston Warner Ventures, which is the founders of GitHub, League of Conservation Voters, and others. And what we do is we help organize people into what's called weekly hours of action. So the goal is, you know, Yale Climate Communication Study says that 29% of people in the US would love to take action on climate or would be motivated to do so if a trusted friend or family member asked them to do so. And yet today only 1% of people are actually doing it. So Climate Change Makers is all about taking the passionate few who do want to, you know, put pressure on their Congress people or put pressure on, you know, their local news outlets or whatever to engage around climate policy or climate stories. That group hopefully brings in their friends and family and engages them as well in what's called a weekly hour of action, which is just a really lightweight way to learn about how to take political action. We actually have our next hour of action up this morning here at 9 a.m. Pacific. So in 40 minutes, if anyone's interested, just shoot me a DM and I'll shoot you the link. We'd love to have you join us. We do them on Wednesdays mornings and Friday and Thursday evenings. It's just a great way to get involved and to try to expand your influence and make a difference. So that's been my path. It's been fantastic, you know, being able to kind of pivot my career inside the company I'm in, and then also to, you know, really lean into the political action side of things. And yes, there is an EU wing of Climate Change Makers as well. Thank you, Liam. For those of you in the EU, that's recently up and running also.
Awesome. Thanks so much, all four of you, for those brief introductions. So I'm going to kick us off with a few questions to start with. But folks, if you have any further questions that you'd like to ask, please put them in the chat, and we'll come to them in due time. So just to kick us off, then, I guess the big question in the room is, why does climate action, corporate climate action, matter? Why don't we just wait for a government intervention or policy changes or for consumer demand to change? Why do corporates need to take climate action? Let's go to Annie first, and then we can go around if others want to chip in as well.
Great, thanks, Liam. I think corporate climate action matters for the simple reason that there's a critical mass amount of size and influence and resources that can be directed in a tactical way to small enough to do but big enough to matter areas. And what I mean by that is it's not as big as the government. The corporate sector is not as big as the government. It's not as small as an individual. It's a really good critical mass size in between where, you know, a couple of thousand people or 100,000 people are part of a community that where they can actually drive societal change and demand better from their own leaders. I think corporate climate action is a way for existing capitalist entities to really be incubation chambers for bigger ideas that could be scaled on a societal level by individuals and by governments. But they're essentially incubation chambers testing what ideas could work and what could not by applying them in their own value chains, in their own supply chains. So I think corporate climate action is one way to let the market give you feedback on, is this sustainable solution or is this climate solution really creating an impact on the environment, on our society? And if it's not, try something else, right? And if it works, it can actually be scaled across other types of stakeholders too. So I think corporate climate action is like, is the incubation chamber for this wicked problem.
Quick follow-up for you, Ani, just before we move on. Are you seeing where in your context in New Delhi or in India at large, like that in fact corporate climate leadership is like leading the charge, or are you seeing other examples of government action or rumors of government action? Like what is the landscape where you are?
So unfortunately, where I'm based, we're not as evolved. Like there are only very few companies that genuinely care about leading from the front and doing what's right environmentally as well as socially and economically. Most organizations are driven by social and economic reasons, right? Less so by environmental reasons. But there are a few that have actually taken on, they're leading the charge and preceding compliance. So before compliance measures actually kick in, they're creating, pathways to carbon neutrality, pathways to water efficiency, pathways to zero waste, and they're actually being rewarded by the market for it. Because today consumers want better of the companies they are patrons of. Supply chain vendors want better to an extent, right? Employees want better from the companies that they work at. And regulators will eventually kick in and force the other 980 companies that haven't really adopted these practices to follow suit. So the ones who are doing it are being exponentially rewarded in society. The ones who are not will have to at some point, at the crack of a whip, essentially. But push-based mechanisms, in my opinion, don't work. I think it has to inherently come from within.
Thanks, Annie. Marina, do you want to jump in, or Tim and Cody?
Sure, I would just love to add to that, in that I think there's also a very important role that business leaders can play that have understood, the science behind the climate crisis to really positively influence political change as well. So right now, the world is really, talking about how sluggish policy has been. It's also largely due to the fact that policy has been, largely, many instances also hindered by business lobbies. So there is a new force which is starting to emerge, which is actually companies that get the climate crisis and are starting to lobby for good. And if that could, that momentum could scale, I think there is also a phenomenal opportunity there to drive change with the business community, with the power and the, also the funding that corporations have.
Yeah, and I'll add, I think there's a lot you can do just, inside your organization. So one thing I didn't mention in my intro, about a year ago now, maybe a little more than a year ago, I co-founded a green team inside Techstars. Actually, Tim came and gave a talk to us early on about how to help ourselves get organized. And it was really just a grassroots effort of people who care, and started really pushing for change inside the organization, doing things like auditing our travel policies, doing things like auditing our office footprints, doing things like advocating to our executive team that we should be signing things like the UNPRI and like creating an ESG mandate inside the company. And it worked. I mean, all of that stuff is happening now and is being adopted by corporate leadership. It took about a year. And, Techstars is a pretty progressive company in general. But I don't know that it would have happened top down without the bottoms up intervention. And some of it is bringing data to the party, like showing people that companies that have an ESG footprint score higher on employee satisfaction than companies who don't. I'll share when I'm done talking, I'll share a study that talks about that. Sharing that, ESG is going to be important from a recruiting perspective and in terms of attracting talent. Obviously the financial mandates that are starting to happen in terms of investors in the public markets holding companies accountable to sustainability and ESG related metrics from a stock perspective are, impacting public stocks. That's also trickling into private equities and private capital. So helping, your executive leadership team understand all of that is really important. And so, that bottoms up work is critical. And if you're in a big company, it's beyond just your own company operations. I've shared the link to Climate Voices. It's also who your company is lobbying and what they're lobbying for. So, helping your executive team understand that there's a light starting to be shown on that sort of stuff. And if, your company is aggressively lobbying for policies that are bad for the environment, like those are going to turn into, PR issues and things like that, not to mention all the employee satisfaction and whatnot. I think, was it, so one of you will know better than me. I think it was either Amazon or Google where they've lobbied, internally put a lot of pressure on the amount of work that the company was doing to support AI and machine learning work for the fossil fuel industry to do exploration. And they have actually stopped doing it now as a result of employee pressure. So I think all of that matters tremendously.
Just add one thing. My thought when I heard this question is similar to my thoughts around the question about individual action and individual responsibility, and the argument that, well, one individual just doesn't matter because it can't make enough difference. And in my mind, I think the majority of us have agreed, I think everybody in this room could probably agree, that we need systemic change, right? Like the path forward is systemic change. And every individual and every corporation is part of the system. Like the system doesn't exist without its parts, and the system doesn't change if the parts don't change. So to think that corporations can't change and the system can change is insane to me. So that's why I think it's important, because by definition, systemic change requires all parts of the system to be different.
Spot on, Tim. I agree with you there, definitely. Thanks, everyone. We've kind of halfway answered some of the other questions in my list as well, but I'll carry on anyway. And if we overlap, that's probably fine. So the next question is about within an organization that wants to develop a sustainability or climate action strategy, how can a company or an organization develop that strategy without falling into the greenwashing trap, making sure that their strategy has a real impact? Let's go to Marina first for this one.
Sure. I've been also following some great questions in the chat. I think actually to talk about where companies can make a real difference, I think one space is actually climate education. And let me get to that, was that conversation is going on in the chat. And Deloitte is the one company I'd like to call out for that one. First company I'd like to highlight is Unilever. That really has been the one really setting the stage for transitioning sustainability into like the full integral strategy of the organization and shifting it away from CSR. They have actually integrated the function of sustainability into the CMO role. So the CMO actually has the job, the CMO is the Chief Sustainability Officer at the same time. So they actually, the same person needs to drive revenue growth as well as manage down the environmental impact, which is a phenomenal challenge, but that really, you know, it just encapsulates the problem. And because of that, they have needed to also, you know, they've chosen to work on systemic issues within their own system, for sure. But, you know, taking a very, very collaborative approach across the entirety of their supply chain. I think second company, you know, Microsoft has you know, very different carbon footprint to other organizations in the sense that they, you know, are largely, you know, dealing more with software than they are with hardware. But their sustainability strategy, from my experience, is one of the most robust in terms of, you know, how they have actually been, you know, interrogating terminology between, you know, net zero, carbon neutral, and their ambition to actually go carbon negative by 2030 and remove the environment, the equivalent of all the carbon the company has ever emitted since its founding by 2050 is quite bold. So they're sort of doing more than just a net zero commitment, but actually really looking to drive forward the technologies that are going to be needed for carbon removal, you know, both technical and nature-based. And I think that's, you know, setting very, very, you know, bold statement. And also Shopify, you know, by actively placing bets on technologies within the carbon removal space as part of their net zero, you know, commitments. These are organizations that are definitely doing more than a normal company would need to. I think the problem that I still see is many companies still going at it alone, and you know, and therefore not really you know, bringing change together, this sort of more collective change. I think any corporate sustainability strategy needs to have an enormous component around renewable energy, which any company that has a sustainability strategy has already sort of ticked off. But this point about climate education across the workforce is also phenomenally important. And there I was pleased to see Deloitte announced last week that they are rolling out a climate education program to all 330,000 employees worldwide, which is great, because the more people across an organization understand the consequences of climate change, the more likely, you know, they will also be able to, you know, deliver meaningful consulting strategies to their clients as well. So I think that's also a good shout out and a good call out. I think I'll pause there and let others talk.
Yeah, I'll add that it's really tempting for organizations to take a PR first approach to climate, given how topical it is, and that is clearly the wrong strategy. You know, it's easy to say, hey, let's do a moonshot pledge, let's set a net zero goal for 2035 or 2040 or whatever, and then figure out what we're going to do to support it, but let's get that PR announcement out there. And you know, the reality of it is, if you haven't done the bottoms up work for a while to understand how to actually decarbonize your industry, most of those net zero pledges are just going to result in what I call carbon accounting, which is, you know, buying offsets and trying to, you know, use that as an opportunity to continue to do business as usual, but you know, put money toward essentially shifting the carbon balance on your balance sheet by buying offsets from a third party. And at the end of the day, I think a lot of the research is starting to show that most of those offsets, you know, either have issues with the permanency around them, have issues with the additionality around them, or in some other way aren't making that much of a difference. And if the company thinks that they can buy those offsets and then continue to do business as usual, it actually may be more damaging for the environment, because they are now doing it from the perspective of you know, feeling like they're doing the right thing, but really they're not. And so I think a really important thing, back to the question of like how to avoid greenwashing, is to have a true bottoms up focus on how you're going to decarbonize your own industry. And so that means putting R&D investments into material science, into looking at, you know, your own manufacturing practices. That means leaning into innovation, building in, you know, whether it's an incubation arm or an arm that works with new technologies, and really leaning into, you know, innovation in that regard. It also means looking deeply at your full supply chain. So there's what's called scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 and 2 are essentially what you control. It's like your owned and operated materials. But scope 3 is what's deeper down your supply chain. And so, you know, where are you buying your products from? Where are you sourcing your products from? What type of policies and practices did those organizations have in place? And, you know, for most complicated products that are manufactured, you know, you're not even necessarily just getting raw materials from somewhere. You're buying a widget that was made by someone who was getting those raw materials from somewhere else, or maybe 3 steps down the chain. It's really hard for companies to get their head around all of that stuff. And so real investments into understanding the full sort of impact of your scope 3 emissions, and putting pressure on your suppliers to get better carbon management practices in their own supply businesses, or threatening to cut ties and find alternative suppliers, like really it can make a huge difference. Something like 80% of a given company's emissions often come out of their scope 3 supply chain, which is all the downstream materials that they're buying. Because you think about it, like those are the raw materials that are actually have to be produced somewhere, manufactured somewhere, or extracted from the earth somewhere. So, you know, putting a heavy focus there is really a critical factor, beyond just, you know, hey, let's do a net zero pledge and we'll figure it out later.
I would just add one quick note to how to avoid greenwashing. I think be transparent and be honest. With carbon offsets, for example, like it's one of the accessible things that organizations can do today, and it's still yet to be proven out. Like, as Cody was saying, is it actually effective? So for the companies who are like, yeah, we're going to do this because we want to do something now, that's great. But if they're not being transparent with the reality of it and educating their employees and their customers at the same time, and not assuming that they've educated themselves, then I think they're greenwashing. Because if you make a statement that says we're going carbon neutral, our first effort is to do offsets, and you don't complement that statement with an asterisk of what do offsets mean, then you're not fully communicating. I think that transparency and willingness to be wrong today, be wrong in the future about what you're saying today, and admit that in the future and say, hey, now we have more science, now we have more information. This is how we did it in the past. This is how we're adjusting in the future because that didn't work as well, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I would also just echo and add, yes, I mean, in addition to measuring scope 1, 2, and 3, really, having external verification for the carbon emissions reduction plan and working together with organizations like the Science Based Target Initiative, it's also really, really important. I mean, the minute an organization puts out a net zero claim, but does not have a science-based emissions reduction target, you already know it is greenwashing. So that is, I think, a very very important point to have external verification as well.
Totally. And I would actually love to see someone who's relying a lot on offsets to like have the transparency to say, oh yeah, these offsets didn't work, and so now we're going to go with like these other ones. Like if you know that you've purchased offsets through a reforestation effort and all those trees have burned down, for example, like rather than like feel ashamed that your plan didn't work, I feel like we need to be able to, be honest about failures too. And there was a question that came through the chat about offsets and the tendency to over rely on these in net zero pledges. So just while we're on this topic of like looking out for greenwashing or making sure actions are robust, if anyone wants to touch any more on this subject, I welcome that from that question.
Thanks, Lainey, and thanks, folks. I'm gonna move us on to a next question because I'm conscious of the time, and then we'll start digging into some of these items in the chat as well. I'm actually going to skip one and go to my last question, which I think has kind of been touched on already. But the question is, what can individuals do in their workplace? And I think it's probably worth calling out that individuals might be at any point in their in the hierarchy of a workplace. So from kind of one of the thousands of employees in a large organization right up to members of the executive board, what are the things that employees can do in their workplace? And I'm going to go to Tim first, who has kind of lots of experience of that, and then Cody, and then Annie and Marina as well.
Thanks, Liam. The first thing that comes to mind for me on this topic is privilege and the importance of each individual thinking about and kind of acknowledging where they lie on the privilege spectrum, like what kind of privileges do they have and which ones might they not be enjoying. From my own personal experience, when I took individual climate action within a company, when I look back on it, I was like, wow, well, even as I was doing it and people were, pinging me on a private Slack DM and saying, hey, thanks for saying that in front of the whole company, I would have never said that. I realized that there were certain privileges I had, whether it was my whiteness, my maleness, my title at the company as a director and not an individual contributor, or whatever it was, my experience in my career, like 10 years in versus 1 year in, I felt more comfortable speaking up and saying what I believed. And not everybody feels that way because they're earlier in their career. They don't have the same privileges that other people have. So I think that's really, really, really important because not every individual has the same opportunities within an organization because of the system that we work in and its deficiencies. With that in mind, I say what you can do is have conversations. One thing that I've found is, and heard a lot from people, is that I don't even feel comfortable bringing up this topic. It's a hot button topic, or it's, once it's brought up, people just react weird or try to avoid it or change the topic. And I think normalizing that discussion is a really important first step, and just creating a culture and an environment where it can be talked about up and down. And start with your sphere of influence. If that's your one coworker that also has concerns about climate change, start there. If it's your team of 4 or 5 people, start there. If it's your department, so on and so forth. And eventually, the CEO needs to be talking about it. And if the CEO is not talking about it, then if you have the privilege to talk to that person and plead with them to say, you need to acknowledge climate change and have a conversation about it at the company level, I'd say do that. Because if the executives are ignoring it, those are the individuals with the most influence, and they're, by just a side note, I think they're all doing what their investors and their board members are telling them to do, or what they know that their board members will accept from them. Because I've seen CEOs just flat out say, nope, we're not talking about that. It's not important. So push on that if you can. And if you can't, find someone else who can.
Thanks, Tim. Cody?
Yeah, I'll just give the playbook for what we did inside Techstars. So the very first thing I did was I started a Slack channel, just called Topic Sustainability, and used it I invited, the handful of people I knew inside the company who I knew to be personally passionate about the topic. And so it started small, just a few of us, and we used it to start sharing articles, sharing resources, sharing information about climate and other, circular economy related topics that we were seeing. that Slack channel just sort of started growing, and now has, I don't know, 100+ people in there across our company, that just sort of helped to build groundswell of momentum. And I do want to acknowledge the privilege question that Tim mentioned. I mean, I'm an executive in the company, so obviously, and I've been there for a very long time, so I do have some degree of sway in terms of basically saying, hey, it's good to talk about these things, or it's okay to talk about these things, but helped create that space for everyone to just get involved and engaged. And then on the heels of that, we decided to launch a green team, which we just did as a grassroots effort. Decided to get a handful of us on the calendar, put a post out saying anyone else who wants to join this green team effort, we're going to start focusing on what we do as a company and how we are, how we're making a difference in the world, to the best of our abilities, both in our own operations and as an investment firm with our portfolio. And so we had our first green team meeting, did a sort of a virtual whiteboarding session where we laid out sort of the key things that we all wanted to try to focus on, tried to bucket those into different categories. So all of a sudden we saw, hey, there's a group of employees who are really concerned with what are our policies. There's a group of employees who are really concerned with what are the resources we're providing our portfolio companies. There's a group of employees who are really concerned with, what are the benefits that the company is providing to employees to encourage them to take better practices themselves, et cetera. And so started dividing those up into different work streams. From there, we created an Asana board so we could start tracking the different work items. People, again, it was all volunteer, all grassroots. People, started signing up for different things that they wanted to own responsibility for, like looking at the carbon footprint of our travel policy, looking at the certifications that the different office buildings we have around the world have, looking at the recycling policies of our different office buildings, looking at the swag and marketing spend that we have and how that relates to sustainability or not, looking at what resources we put in place for our portfolio companies, et cetera. So divided up those work items, started creating action items, and then put a monthly meeting on the calendar where we would all check in, but really everyone had sort of took a pledge to just drive their action item in their own time. It wasn't anything we asked for permission for. We didn't ask, for like executive level approval to do this. Everyone just said, hey, I'll make time to do this in my own schedule. Obviously it helped because it was during COVID, so we're all remote and everyone has a little bit more schedule flexibility than if we're all sitting in an office necessarily. Again, one of the work streams we created was around ESG and all of that, and that really ended up getting adopted by the company. We just continued to put pressure on the leadership team and have had a full embrace of that, and I suspect some of these other efforts will continue to, as they build momentum, will also continue to get adopted and focus. So we just decided to do and figure it out as we went.
Thanks, Cody. Folks, I'm really sorry. I'm aware that the time is flying by and we only have 9 minutes left. So I see that the panelists have been really great at responding in the chat panel to some of the questions that have come in, which is fantastic. I just want to pause and offer Annie and Marina a chance to comment on that last question about what employees can do, and then we'll move towards wrapping up, I think. But over to you, Annie, if you want to say anything.
Yeah, I'll keep mine really quick. I think one really effective strategy is to pick one lever. Cody is going to love this one. One lever that you can get enough people around you to rally behind too. And that one lever could be capital. So every organization has a lot of capital. Most organizations are not democratic. But if you plus 10 more people, say, how do we start creating small ripples with how our organization uses capital? And make a case for capital allocation decisions, even though you don't have any say over it. But you show, how divestment from companies that your organization is invested in, or partnering with the right suppliers, or what are the money decisions your organization makes, identifying 2 or 3 of the stakeholders in that value chain, and then showing how there's an environmental and social and economic impact of changing that partner, changing that supplier, changing that investment, that actually gains a lot of momentum. If you just send that out as a blast, you plus 10 people, enough people get on board with those sorts of, thoughts that your leadership, your corporate leadership may actually take notice and say, hey, we didn't even think about capital being a lever for really strong climate action. It's essentially what BlackRock did. Larry Fink choosing to say, hey, like my $3 trillion portfolio has to divest from fossil fuels in the next couple of years. But you're doing it at the opposite end of Larry Fink, right? You're doing it more grounds up and using capital as a lever for creating change in your supply chain and your customer base. And it's doable. Like I've seen one organization in India do it, ITC. It's a case study to look at how their employees themselves drove a lot of capital allocation decision changes.
Great, and perhaps I'll just sort of layer on all of that, all great points. And I think the first is, regardless of your role within an organization, just find your voice and use it as number one. The second point, absolutely, find comrades and collaborate with others around you. Absolutely critical to drive any sort of action forward. And then within that, there are varying levels of steps that can be taken, many of which have already been outlined. But the organization needs to know what is its environmental impact before it can actually set any actions. So actually focusing on data collection and then solving the problem once the data is there is a clear step that is needed. Lastly, find out how the organization works and what motivation is going to drive them to implement a sustainability strategy. For some companies, it's brand reputational risk. For others, it's the talent retention and acquisition point. For others, it can be business innovation. Many companies that have been really, advanced in their sustainability strategies have actually been able to, make a business case for growth. So while we here are perhaps more focused on, real climate action, sometimes to drive results, you need to work with the levers that are most comfortable to the stakeholders around you. So if you can figure out a way how to drive revenue and save the planet at the same time, it usually works.
Great stuff. Thanks, Marina. Okay, I'm conscious we've got 5 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is just ask the panelists to give a 1 minute closing remark. Any final tips on any of the topics we've covered so far today, or anything that we didn't get a chance to cover today, or something you spotted in the chat that you wanted to mention. But let's try and aim for 1 minute each, and I'll go to Cody first.
Yeah, I'm going to parrot what my Climate Changemakers co-founder, Eliza Nimzer, told me when I first contacted her a year and a half ago, as I was just getting started in my own journey. And she said, look, dude, it's great. Go out and learn, like spend a month or two learning, but there's no time to waste. Like, get your shit going. I don't know if she used those exact words, but she basically said, like, figure out what you need to know. You don't need to become a PhD. Like, use what you already are good at and put it to work toward climate. And that you don't need to make a wholehearted change and like start your career over. Like, leverage the influence you already have, but with a climate lens on it, and get going. And I've just embraced that wholeheartedly and have been diving in.
Awesome. Thank you, Cody. Let's go to Tim.
I guess I'll continue my theme today. Encourage everyone as they're doing whatever work they're doing, whether it's finding your climate career, building a climate company, changing the culture of your company to be more climate friendly. Just remember to focus on your health and what you need to push things forward. I think it's really, a lot of us are really passionate about this, and it's really easy to get swept up in it and not slow down. And as I was thinking about climate communities and thinking about things like climate change makers and relative to other communities, I thought of the pace. And on both ends of the spectrum of like the speed at which we need to move are there's no time left and this will take time. And both of those things are true.
Thanks, Tim. It's definitely a marathon and not a sprint. So that's a very good closing remark. Let's go to Marina and then Annie to finish us off.
So, first piece of parting advice would absolutely be spend time doing your homework first, because that gives you confidence. So having the root understanding of climate science and base sustainability strategies can really help. And, while you spend time on learning, get used to the discomfort of not being an expert. And absolutely, I'm in the GSD club. Learning by doing, you're doing something that usually nobody else has done within your company. So just do it.
And my final thought on this would be that climate can be overwhelmingly large as a problem. If you think about solving climate crisis, solving the climate crisis. But if you think about it in terms of small bite-sized chunks that, whoever you are, whatever you are really good at already doing, bringing in your expertise, whether it's great psychology, great storytelling, great economics, great design, whatever. There is always something that's small enough to do but big enough to matter that can be done today, right? And you can actually look at it as bite-sized chunks that will move the needle slowly, but they all add up. So this is the single best piece of advice I keep reminding myself of for the last year and a half. Small enough to do, big enough to matter. And just keep moving the needle forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Annie. And thank you again to all four of the panelists. And of course, the participants as well from our current Learning for Action cohort and our current Clean Energy Week participants as well. Thanks for being here. I don't have anything more to say other than those thanks, but Lainey, do you have any final words before we close out?
No, just echoing your thanks, Liam, and we'll share the chat as well as the recording with everyone who has joined and everyone in the cohort, because there's been some amazing comments and resources and questions shared in the chat. Thank you everyone for paying attention to that as we go through. And yeah, I really learned a lot and gained a lot of great resources from you all. So big thanks to our wonderful Terra alumni who have joined us today.
Awesome. So grateful for Terra, so grateful for this community. So it's just an honor to be a part of it.
Echo that. It's an amazing community. Thank you all. Just helps. We're
Yeah.
not alone.
Thank you for having us.